A dog that almost never barked at a wall for 3 days straight. Not a door, not a window, not something moving in the yard outside, just a wall. A completely plain, painted, ordinary section of hallway wall, and nothing else. And by the time Daniel Carter finally grabbed a hammer and broke it open, the police were already on their way. Because what was hidden inside that wall, sealed behind plaster and fresh paint, completely invisible to every human who had ever walked past it, had been sitting there quietly for 8 years. 8 years? Right inside the home where Daniel slept every night, cooked dinner, watched TV, and went about his life without a single reason to worry. He had absolutely no idea. But his dog did. His dog had known for 3 days, and he had been trying, desperately, to make Daniel understand. This isn't a story about a lucky coincidence. This isn't a story about a pet finding a stray cat in the walls, or a family of raccoons in the attic. This is the story of how a German Shepherd's nose cracked open a cold case that investigators had quietly stopped chasing, and how one ordinary man's decision to finally trust his dog, instead of just shushing him and going back to bed, led to a conviction that had been 8 years in the making. Stay with me all the way to the end of this one, because I promise you, the part that is going to make your jaw drop isn't just what was in the wall. It's the story of the man who put it there, and how close he came to getting away with it forever. Before we get into the investigation, and we are going to get into every single detail of it, you need to understand the two main characters in this story. Because this isn't just a crime story. At its heart, it's a story about trust. Daniel Carter was 34 years old when all of this happened. He was the kind of person you would pass on the street and never think twice about. Quiet, steady, the type who kept to himself without being unfriendly about it. He worked in logistics coordination for a mid-sized supply company. The kind of job where you sit at a desk, move numbers around, and the biggest drama of your week is a late shipment from a warehouse 3 states away. He was not dramatic. He was not impulsive. He liked routine, and routine liked him back. He had moved into the house 6 years before any of this happened. Single story, brick house, sitting at the edge of a small residential neighborhood, the kind of street where people still wave from their driveways, where the sidewalks are old enough that the tree roots have pushed the concrete up in slow, gentle waves, where you can hear the neighborhood go quiet after 9 p.m. Daniel had been proud of that house from the day he moved in. He had painted the living room himself on a Saturday afternoon with bad music playing from his phone. He installed a new kitchen faucet. He learned to fix a leaking pipe under the bathroom sink from a tutorial video. He was the kind of man who took care of things quietly, without a lot of fuss, and that house was one of the things he took care of most. And then there was Max. Max was a 5-year-old German Shepherd, big-chested, black and tan, with a thick coat and calm amber eyes that always seemed like they were watching something just slightly beyond what anyone else could see. And here's the part about Max that you need to understand before anything else in this story makes sense. Max was not just a pet. He was not just a house dog who happened to be a German Shepherd. Max had come from a retired canine training program. He had spent the first 2 years of his life going through structured scent training, obedience work, tracking, detection protocols. He had never made it all the way through to active service, and the records on exactly why were never entirely clear. But the training had shaped him into something more than a companion animal. It had given him a framework for the world, a way of processing and responding to information that most dogs simply don't have. Max didn't bark at squirrels. He didn't lose his mind when the mailman came. He didn't whine at Daniel for attention when he was trying to sleep. He was measured, deliberate. He communicated when he had something to say, and he was quiet when he didn't. In 5 years of living together, Daniel could count on one hand the number of times Max had barked with genuine urgency, once at a stranger who had lingered too long near the gate late at night, and once, notably, when there was a gas leak in the kitchen that Daniel hadn't noticed until the alarm went off several minutes later. Max did not make noise unless something was actually wrong. That is the single most important thing to understand about the morning this story begins. It started just after 7 a.m. on a Tuesday. Daniel was in the kitchen coffee brewing, phone in hand, half reading something he probably couldn't even tell you about now. Max had already been fed. The front door was closed. Everything was exactly as it always was on a regular Tuesday morning. Then, from down the hallway, came a single sharp bark. Daniel looked up. He waited a few seconds. Sometimes Max heard something outside a car backfiring. Kids on the way to school. He wasn't immediately concerned. Then it came again. Sharp, focused, and then again. He set his phone down and walked to the hallway doorway. Max was standing at the far end of the hall, maybe 12 feet away, completely still, facing the left wall. Not the front door, which was right there to the side. Not the window at the end of the hallway. The wall. His ears were straight up. His body was rigid in that particular way. That wasn't aggressive, wasn't about to lunge energy, but locked. Completely, totally locked in, like every ounce of his focus and attention was pointed at that one specific section of plain white drywall. Daniel called his name. Max didn't even glance back. He walked over, crouched down, tapped the wall with his knuckle. Solid. Completely solid. He told Max there was nothing there, scratched behind his ears, and went back to his coffee. He figured it would pass. Maybe there was a mouse inside the wall somewhere. Old houses do that. They collect small mysteries. He told himself it would stop by lunchtime. It did not stop by lunchtime. By noon, Max had been back to that exact same spot 4 more times, same position, same wall, same relentless focus. Daniel checked the baseboard. He went around to the other side, into a small storage room he barely ever used, and looked at the wall from that direction. Nothing. No holes, no chew marks, no sign of anything trying to get in or out. By 6 p.m., Max had skipped his afternoon nap. In 5 years, Daniel had never once seen that dog skip his afternoon nap. By 9 p.m., neighbors 2 houses down were texting to ask if everything was all right. That is how loud and consistent the barking had become. Daniel texted back that Max had probably found a mouse or something. Sorry about the noise. But even as he typed that, he wasn't entirely sure he believed it himself. Daniel woke up Wednesday morning to silence, and for about 4 seconds he felt genuine relief. Then he heard it again, that same focused, sharp bark from down the hallway. He lay in bed for a moment, staring at the ceiling. He had gotten maybe 4 hours of broken sleep the night before, because Max had started again around 2 a.m., and hadn't fully settled until almost 5. He got up, made his coffee, walked to the hallway, and there was Max. Same spot, same wall, same absolute, unwavering focus. But something was different that morning, and the moment Daniel noticed it, something cold settled quietly in his chest. Max's food bowl was sitting on the kitchen floor, completely full, exactly where Daniel had put it the night before. He stood there with his coffee mug halfway to his mouth, and just looked at it. In 5 years, that dog had never missed a meal. Not once. Not for illness, not for weather, not for distraction. Max ate his meals the way he did everything else, consistently, reliably, without exception. And now the bowl sat there full and untouched, because Max had decided that whatever was happening in that hallway was more important than food. Daniel walked the bowl over to him. He said Max's name. He set the bowl right beside him. Max glanced at it for maybe half a second, then turned back to the wall. That was the moment, Daniel said later in an interview, when the situation stopped feeling like a quirky dog thing. When it stopped being an inconvenience and started being something he didn't have a word for yet. He crouched down next to Max and pressed his own ear against the wall. Silence. No scratching, no movement, nothing he could pick up on at all. He even sniffed the air right near the baseboard, feeling a bit ridiculous doing it, but caught nothing. Just dust. Old paint. The neutral smell of a house that had been a house for a long time. But Max was detecting something. Something real enough and important enough to make a trained, disciplined, food-obsessed German Shepherd abandon every one of his normal rhythms and stand guard in a hallway for the 2nd day in a row. That night, the barking changed, and this is the part that Daniel said genuinely unsettled him. It got quieter. The loud, sharp, attention-grabbing barks gradually gave way to something lower, shorter, a sustained, rumbling growl with brief bursts underneath it. The kind of vocalization that dogs produce when they are no longer trying to get your attention, when they've already made their judgment about the situation. And now they're just keeping watch. Daniel sat at his kitchen table at nearly midnight, listening to it drift down the hallway toward him. And the hair on the back of his neck stood up. By Thursday morning, Daniel Carter had made his decision. He was opening the wall. He told himself it was for practical reasons. He needed his dog to settle down. He needed to sleep. He needed to prove once and for all that there was nothing there. But honestly, if you ask him today, he'll tell you the truth. He was scared. He had been scared since Wednesday night. He wanted to know what Max knew. He went to the storage room first, the small room on the other side of that hallway wall. He hadn't been inside in a couple of months. It smelled like cardboard and dust. Boxes of old books he'd never unpacked, a folded card table, a broken lamp he'd been meaning to throw away for 2 years. He walked over to the wall and knocked on it from this side. Solid. He knocked again in a different spot. Still solid. Nothing unusual. But then Max pushed past him into the room. Daniel hadn't even realized the dog had followed him in and walked in a straight, direct line to one specific section of the wall. He pressed his nose flat against the paint. He held it there, and then he turned and looked up at Daniel with those calm amber eyes. Right here. This exact spot. Right here. Daniel crouched down slowly and ran his hand across the surface. And there, visible now only because he was looking for it, only because he was right up close in the light from the small room's window, was something he had missed completely before. One section of the wall, maybe 2 feet wide, just above the baseboard, had a slightly different texture. Not dramatically, not obviously, the kind of difference that registers as nothing if you're just walking past, but registers as something when you're close and paying attention. The paint was fractionally smoother. They're applied over a surface that had been patched and resurfaced, the way a repair looks when someone has done it carefully and tried to blend it in. And there was something else. A smell. Barely there. Faint in a way that made him almost doubt himself, made him wonder if his tired, 3-day stressed brain was inventing it. But it was there. A heaviness near the baseboard. Something low and organic that didn't belong in a dusty storage room. Daniel stood up slowly, walked to the garage, came back with a flathead screwdriver. Max watched him from the doorway, completely still. The first time Daniel pressed the screwdriver into the plaster, it gave more easily than it should have. A small crack appeared. Max immediately came forward, but barking louder than he had in 3 days, pacing in tight steps, whining between each bark. Daniel told him to take it easy, but his own voice came out uneven and uncertain. The voice of a man who is telling himself to stay calm because some part of him already suspects he is not going to want to see what he's about to see. He pressed harder. The crack widened. Another thin line spread diagonally across the patched section of wall, and the smell got stronger. Not overwhelming, not pouring out of the hole, but stronger in a way that his body responded to before his brain had time to process it. His stomach tightened. He stepped back without consciously deciding to. He went to the garage a second time. Came back with a hammer. His hands were not completely steady when he raised it. The first swing cracked the plaster and knocked a chunk loose. Dust fell to the floor. A hole opened up roughly the size of a fist, and behind it was darkness. Max was frantic now, pacing, whining, barking in rapid short bursts. Daniel didn't swing again immediately. He stood there for a long moment with the hammer at his side, staring into that small black opening. And he said later that in that moment he already knew. He couldn't have told you what he knew. Exactly. He didn't have names. He didn't have context. He didn't have anything concrete. But somewhere in the deep, instinctive part of him that had been listening to his dog for 3 days, he understood that what was inside that wall was not a mouse, was not a structural problem, was not anything that a handyman could fix on a Saturday afternoon. He pressed his face to the hole anyway. The smell hit him fully. Old, dense, unmistakable in a way that bypassed every rational thought in his head and went straight to something primitive. He took 2 more swings. Then 3. The hole widened big enough now to see clearly inside, and there, in the dark narrow space between the drywall and the exterior brick of the house, was a shape, large, wrapped tightly in thick black plastic, secured carefully with what looked like heavy construction tape, layered over and over with someone's methodical, deliberate attention. Daniel Carter stepped backward until his shoulders hit the opposite wall. He stood there for what felt like a very long time. Then he raised his phone and dialed 911. Officers arrived in 12 minutes. The first 2 on the scene took one look at the hole in that wall, spoke briefly to each other, and immediately began clearing the house. Within 20 minutes, there were 4 squad cars parked on the street outside. Within an hour, detectives had arrived, and the storage room had been taped off as an active crime scene. Daniel stood in his front yard in the cold morning air. Max sat pressed directly against his leg. Daniel kept one hand on the dog's back, partly to keep Max calm and partly, he'd admit, to keep himself steady. Neighbors had gathered on the sidewalk. Nobody said much. A detective named Sarah Lenz Compact, experienced, with over a decade in the department, walked out to Daniel while her colleagues worked methodically inside. She had her notepad open. She asked him to walk her through it, all of it, from the beginning. Daniel told her everything. The barking starting Tuesday. The skipped meals. The way Max's behavior had shifted from urgent to something quieter and more serious. The paint texture he'd noticed. The faint smell near the baseboard. Lens wrote steadily without looking up from her notepad. Then she paused and looked over at Max. "Your dog, is he trained?" she asked. "Former canine program," Daniel said. "He didn't complete active service, but he went through scent training." Lens looked at Max for a moment, those calm amber eyes looking right back at her, and she wrote something down. The remains were removed from the wall cavity over the next several hours, with forensics photographing every stage before anything was touched or moved. The plastic wrapping was old and deteriorated in places, but the way the concealment had been constructed, the layering, the care, the thoroughness told investigators something important before any lab work came back. This had not been done in a panic. This was not a rushed, terrified burial. Whoever had done this had taken their time. They had thought about it. They had been organized and deliberate about it. The medical examiner confirmed that evening what Daniel's body had already told him through that hole in the wall. The remains were human. Adult male. The deterioration was consistent with a concealment period of somewhere between 6 and 10 years. The investigation had officially begun, and what detectives found when they started pulling on the threads of this case, when they started looking backward through the history of that house, is the part of this story that made an entire department go very still. 8 years earlier, a man named Mark Halstead had lived in that house. Mark was 41 at the time. A quiet, self-contained man who ran a small property management company, nothing large, just a handful of rental units scattered around the county. He wasn't wealthy, but he was comfortable and steady. He had no family in the area. A few acquaintances, not many close friends. He lived alone. He kept to himself. And then, one spring, Mark Halstead simply wasn't there anymore. His car was gone. His phone went dead. He hadn't left a note, but he also hadn't said goodbye to anyone who might have expected it. The people who knew him, and there were not many, assumed he had relocated. It wasn't out of character for someone so private, someone with no deep roots in the community. People disappear into their own lives sometimes, especially people who live quietly and don't leave many footprints. A missing persons report was eventually filed weeks later by a distant cousin who hadn't been able to reach him. Detectives did a standard investigation. A small bank withdrawal had been made the week of his disappearance. His car was never found. There was no sign of struggle in the house. No witnesses to anything unusual. The working assumption became, by quiet default, that Mark Halstead had chosen to leave. It happens. The case never officially closed, but it faded. The file went into a drawer, and the years went past it. Nobody knew that, while all of that was happening, Mark Halstead was right there, sealed inside the wall of his own home, 3 feet from a hallway that would eventually be walked through daily by a man who had no idea, and a dog who would one day know immediately. When the dental records came back, confirmed. When the DNA results came through, Detective Lens pulled the old case file and sat with it for a while at her desk. Then she and her partner, Detective Ray Morales, started pulling every thread they could find from the months before Mark Halstead disappeared. They were looking for one specific type of person, someone who had access to that house, someone who knew how walls were built and how to repair them, someone with tools, materials, construction knowledge, and the cold-blooded composure to use all of them in the worst possible way. Cold cases are solved by patterns, not dramatic confessions, not sudden witnesses arriving out of nowhere. They're solved by small details that were always present, always recorded somewhere, just waiting for someone to finally put them in the right order. Lenz and Morales pulled county permit records going back 10 years on the property. They looked for any documented renovation work, any contracted job, any licensed professional who had been given access to that house and those walls. And one name appeared 3 times across those records. Stephen Rourke, licensed contractor, based roughly 40 miles away. He had completed 2 verified renovation jobs for Mark Halstead, one approximately 14 months before Mark disappeared, and one that had begun about 6 weeks before the disappearance, with no clean record of a final completion inspection. No sign-off, no formal end date on record. That second job, the one with no clear finish, had covered, among other things, interior wall repairs in the hallway section of the house. Lenz and Morales looked at each other. Then they picked up the phone. Stephen Rourke was 56 years old now. He still ran his contracting business. He came in for questioning willingly, without immediately requesting a lawyer, which, in Lenz's experience, meant either genuine confidence or a very well-practiced arrogance, and from the outside, those two things can look almost identical. He said he barely remembered the job. He said he'd worked hundreds of projects over the years and couldn't be expected to recall everyone. He said Mark Halstead was just another client, just another name in an old ledger. But the details started coming apart almost immediately. His account of when the job had ended was inconsistent. He gave 2 different dates in the same conversation, catching himself and adjusting, which is the kind of thing that looks like a small slip and is actually something much more significant. His description of the specific work he had performed didn't line up with what the permit records showed. Small mismatches, the kind that a careful person might not even notice in the moment, but that detectives are trained to collect and stack up quietly. And when Morales mentioned, almost casually, that forensics had pulled material samples from the wall cavity, that certain adhesives and construction compounds had specific batch characteristics that could potentially be traced back through supply records, something shifted in Rourke's face. Just slightly. Just for a moment. But Lenz had been watching for it. The second interview was scheduled. The physical evidence that came back from the lab was the kind that prosecutors describe as difficult to argue against. Tool marks in the plaster repair were found to be consistent with tools recovered from Rourke's own inventory. The specific type and configuration of a plastering implement that left faint, distinctive patterns in the setting compound. A particular brand of heavy-duty construction adhesive used to seal the wall cavity matched a product that Rourke had purchased in substantial quantity during the relevant period, confirmed through supplier records and old receipts that had never been thrown away. And then, perhaps most critically of all, a partial fingerprint, preserved almost impossibly by the specific way the plastic wrapping had protected one interior surface from the humidity and the years. A partial fingerprint that came back as a match to Stephen Rourke. When confronted with the fingerprint in the second interview, this time with his attorney present, this time with the full weight of the forensic file laid on the table, the wall that Rourke had been maintaining for 8 years started to come down. The story that finally emerged was, in the way these stories almost always are, both complicated and heartbreakingly simple. Mark Halstead had accused Rourke of skimming money from the renovation budget. Not a vast sum by some measures, but enough. Several $1,000s in materials billed and never purchased, pocketed instead. Mark had documentation. He had made it clear that he intended to report Rourke to the licensing board, which would have been more than enough to cost Rourke his contractor's license, his livelihood, the thing his entire life was built around. The confrontation happened at the house. Rourke said it wasn't planned. He said it escalated faster than he expected. Mark was angry, confrontational, not backing down. Rourke lost control, grabbed him, struck him. Mark fell and hit his head on the floor of the storage room. He didn't get up. Rourke stood alone in the silence of that house with the full weight of what had just happened pressing down on him, and he made the decision that would define every remaining year of his life. He didn't call for help. He didn't leave. He looked at the wall. He had been in the middle of repairing, and he finished the job. Over the next 2 days, he sealed Mark Halstead inside that wall. He patched the plaster carefully, mixed the compound to match the existing texture as closely as he could, applied fresh paint and even coats, cleaned the storage room, and walked out of that house for the last time. He drove away. He never came back. And for 8 years, he lived with it, built more walls for more clients, drove past that street occasionally, told himself in whatever way a person has to tell themselves things in order to keep functioning that it was over, that it was buried. That time had taken care of it. He never once accounted for a German shepherd with 300 million scent receptors and the stubborn, focused instinct of a dog who knows when something is wrong and absolutely refuses to let it go. Stephen Rourke was convicted and sentenced several months after the investigation concluded. Mark Halstead's remains were returned to his family, who had spent 8 years not knowing, and who finally had something they could lay to rest. After the conviction, the story was picked up by several news outlets, and almost every single piece that ran focused on Max. Not the detective work, not the forensics. Max. Because what he did, what he sensed, what he communicated, and how relentlessly he communicated is genuinely extraordinary from a scientific standpoint, and I want to take a minute to explain why. Because I think it makes everything you just heard even more remarkable. When organic matter decomposes even slowly, even sealed behind layers of construction material, it releases what scientists call volatile organic compounds, VOCs. These are microscopic molecular particles that migrate, over time, through porous materials. They don't move fast. They don't move obviously, but they move. Drywall is porous. Plaster is porous. Paint, depending on its type and age, carries some degree of porosity. Over 8 years, trace amounts of those compounds had been slowly and silently seeping through that wall into the storage room and the hallway beyond it. Not enough for any human nose to register under normal circumstances. Not enough for Daniel to catch standing 2 feet away. But enough. Just enough for a dog whose nose contains approximately 300 million scent receptors compared to roughly 6 million in a human. A dog whose brain's olfactory processing center is, proportionally speaking, about 40 times larger than ours. Max didn't just vaguely smell something off. He identified a specific scent, signature one that his structured training had conditioned him to recognize and respond to as significant. And then he did exactly what his training had taught him to do. He alerted, he held position, he communicated, he refused to stop communicating until the information was acted upon. Dr. Cynthia Harmon, a canine cognition researcher who commented publicly on the case, said something that I find genuinely moving when you set it against everything you've just heard. She said this: "What's remarkable isn't just that the dog detected the scent, it's the sustained, directed alerting behavior over multiple days. That's not instinct alone. That's training combining with intelligence. The dog made a judgment that this required sustained human attention, and he kept communicating that until someone listened. He kept communicating until someone listened." Sit with that for a moment. For 3 full days, Max used every tool available to him to tell Daniel Carter that something was wrong. He barked. He held position. He skipped meals. He changed the tone and character of his vocalizations as the situation developed. He was, in every meaningful sense, doing his job, the job he had been partially trained to do, the job that life had placed directly in front of him with complete dedication and without giving up. And Daniel eventually listened. Life in that house returned to something like normal in the months that followed. The storage room was cleared out properly, and the damaged wall was fully rebuilt. New framing, new drywall, fresh paint. The room smells now of clean construction materials and possibility, the way newly finished spaces always do. There is no trace of what it once held. "Daniel still lives there," he told a reporter in a follow-up piece published after the conviction that he had seriously considered selling. He'd sat with the thought for a while. How could he not? But in the end, he stayed. "This house didn't do anything wrong," he said. "It was just where it happened. It was also where it got found. And Max is 7 years old now, a little grayer around the muzzle, still calm, still watchful, still the same dog who once stood in the hallway for 3 days straight and refused to be dismissed or ignored or pulled away to the couch." Daniel says that sometimes, not every day, not on any kind of schedule, but sometimes Max will slow down as he walks past that section of the hallway. He'll stop for just a moment, he'll look at the wall, and then he'll continue walking, unhurried, back to wherever he was going. Like he remembers. Like he knows what happened there, and what happened after, and what his part in it was. Because of a dog who wouldn't quit a family, got their son back. They got a name instead of a mystery, a burial instead of a silence that never explained itself. A man who believed he had buried the truth so deep and so completely that time itself would finish the job for him, found out that walls don't keep secrets as well as he thought they did. And a dog who never made it to active duty, who washed out of a canine program for reasons nobody seems to have fully recorded, turned out to be exactly the kind of partner who changes everything. Not in a field or a checkpoint or a search grid, in a hallway, in a house, in the quiet, ordinary geography of a regular life. The truth had been hiding in that wall for 8 years. Patient, silent, invisible to every human being who had ever walked past it. Right up until the morning. A German shepherd with 300 million scent receptors and the quiet, immovable stubbornness of a dog who knows he's right, decided that 3 days was long enough. If you watched all the way to the end of this one, thank you. Genuinely. These stories matter to me. Not because they're dramatic, though they are, but because they're real reminders that paying attention, really paying attention, to the ones around us who are trying to tell us something, can change everything, even when the one doing the telling has 4 legs, and a very, very good nose. Hit the like button if this one stayed with you. Subscribe, because I have 3 more stories lined up just like this one, and I'll see you in the next one.